Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, the Pope consoles Congolese victims of atrocities from the country's volatile east. The pontiff welcomes them in Kinshasa on the second day of his trip to the country. Also, trafficking of medical products in the Sahel is on the rise and is costing lives. Investigators reckon that from 2017 to 2021, at over 600 tons of medical contraband was seized in West Africa. And we hear from a top economist about how the gloomy economic outlook forecast for the world is likely to play out in Africa. Growth is expected to pick up in parts, but overall, a slowdown is likely. But first, Pope Francis met with victims of atrocities committed in eastern DR Congo on Wednesday, on the second day of his trip to the country. He sat in silence, his believers still bearing the physical and psychological signs of trauma that they've suffered, travelled to the Vatican embassy in Kinshasa to meet the pontiff. Oliver Farry has more.
On the second day of his visit to the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Pope Francis met with victims of violence in the Central African country. Children as young as 13 recounted harrowing experiences of human rights violations, and the pontiff pointed the finger at those who have profited from the decades-long war in the DRC. The Pope had initially planned to visit Goma in the east of the country, where the notorious M23 movement has recently resumed attacks, but that was shelved for security reasons. Earlier in the day, he arrived for Mass at Kinshasa's Ndolo airport to a rapturous reception. He called for an end to the cycle of violence that has plagued the Democratic Republic of the Congo for decades, and asked Congolese citizens to grant each other a great amnesty of the heart.
Let us do this, brothers and sisters. Do not be afraid to take the crucifix from your neck and out of your pockets, to take it between your hands and hold it close to your heart, in order to share the wounds with the wounds of Jesus.
Many locals had come to the airport hours in advance to make sure they didn't miss the opportunity to see the pontiff, and the significance of the visit was not lost on them.
In Goma, people are suffering. There's war there, and there's too much suffering here in Kinshasa as well. But I hope the Pope coming here gives the order for us to be at peace. There should be peace among us.
On Tuesday, the Pope had denounced Western colonialism, which he said had contributed to the strife in the DRC. Pope Francis is to spend 4 days in the Democratic Republic of the Congo before moving on to the next leg of his trip in South Sudan.
UN investigators say that the scale of medical smuggling in the Sahel appears to be staggering. From the start of 2017 to the end of 2021, at least 605 tons of medical products were seized in West Africa by authorities. Much of the trafficked medicine is substandard or counterfeit, and the distribution is linked to hundreds of thousands of deaths across the continent every year. For more on this, we hear from our regional correspondent, Sam Bradpeace.
According to the UN, the Sahel has become a major epicenter for the trafficking of medical products, some real, others fake. In its latest report, the UN said there were twin factors driving this phenomenon. The first factor is the high prevalence of certain infectious diseases. Take malaria, for example. The Sahel has one of the highest incidences of malaria infection anywhere in the world. The second key factor driving the phenomenon is the lack of affordable medicine. Most people living in the Sahel don't have access to universal healthcare systems, and the region isn't known as a big manufacturer of pharmaceutical products, which means most medicines have to be imported at a higher cost. This leaves a gap for criminal gangs to smuggle medicines, real or fake, into Sahelian countries to sell on the black market at a lower price. But this can have deadly consequences. Now, counterfeit medicines are a problem across Africa generally. In fact, they're linked to more than 260,000 deaths annually on the continent. But in the Sahel, this problem is particularly acute. In Mali, for example, it's estimated that more than 40% of available medicines on the market are either falsified or substandard, something that the UN and others recognize as a major public health problem.
Sam Brown, piece for us there in Senegal. Now, the global economy is heading into a bumpy period this year, with growth dropping from about 3% in 2022 to about 1.9%. Now, that's some of the lowest numbers in decades. A recently released UN investigation reports that the outlook is pretty gloomy for both developed and developing economies, still recovering from a series of crises, from the fallout from the pandemic to the war in Ukraine to the melting effects of climate change. Now, Africa is facing a slowdown from about 4.1% to 3.8%, according to the report. Now, its lead author is with me now, Hamid Rashid. Hamid, thanks so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, first of all, give us a bit of an overview of some of the factors dragging down Africa's current economic prospects.
I think the African continent, the countries overall would face some headwinds this year. I can list 5 factors that will affect the countries more or less in varying degrees. First, of course, high inflation. About 40% of the countries in Africa, they're facing inflation, double-digit inflation right now. And related to that, countries' central banks are raising interest rates, and that is also at the same time, there's downward pressure on the exchange rate. So this is the second factor. Third is the factor you see that there's also significant challenges with debt sustainability. Many of the countries on the continent are facing debt distress or even the risk of default. And the fourth factor is limited fiscal space for the countries. Governments are not able to stimulate growth by increasing the spending. And fifth factor is weak external demand. We expect the growth in Europe and North America, and United States included, would face significant downturn this year that will affect Africa's export to those 2 regions as well. So overall, the picture is quite gloomy. And as you pointed out, 3.8% growth rate for Africa. It is higher than the global average, but still it's not adequate for the continent to remain on the trajectory to achieve the longer-term development goals, including the Sustainable Development Goals.
So you mentioned there in your 5th point that one of the shocks that the region's facing is a drop in demand from its key trading partners. But recently, from Russia to China to the US, we've been seeing this rush to court African favor. Do you think you can read anything into that in terms of perhaps the long-term potential of Africa in terms of how it might be seen as a trading partner?
Africa continue to be a very important trading partner for all developed economies, especially as the world is trying to move into the green economy and net zero green transition that we're talking about. Africa's mineral resources, the critical minerals that we would need for example, for the EVs, electrical vehicles, and the batteries that are needed, most of them would come from Africa. But African governments and economies will have to leverage the resources better in terms of to make sure those resources are utilized not only to promote export or GDP growth, but also to bring prosperity to the average people. Many countries in the past, they've been endowed with a huge amount of natural resources, but that didn't translate to broad-based inclusive economic growth, meaning that poor people didn't always benefit from those natural resources. So going forward, Africa would continue to be a very important trading partner for those others, for many of the advanced and developing countries. But also on the African side, governments will have to do better in terms of leveraging those resources to deliver, poverty reduction and sustainable development for all.
And what else do you think needs to be seen in terms of improving the continent's fiscal position going forward?
I think the biggest challenge for the continent, as we saw that Ghana defaulted recently, other countries are on the brink of default. Before that, during COVID, Zambia defaulted on its external debt. Many of the countries on the continent are laden with huge amount of external debt, and that is affecting their ability to invest in human capital and investing in infrastructure. So there has to be some meaningful restructuring of the debt, because countries, if governments are spending 50% of their revenue on servicing external debt. That is not sustainable because you need a sufficient amount of resources to invest in domestic priorities, including, as I mentioned, in health and education and overall human capital development. So the development partners or the trading partners of the African continent, they'll have to come together and would need to discuss and provide meaningful debt restructuring so that there's more fiscal space there, and also so that the countries can actually stimulate economic growth and come out of this lull in the global economy. Because this is a challenging year for all of us, but especially for African continent, because just to put it in perspective, many people would say Africa is growing faster than the rest of the world economy, but that's not sufficient because at 3.8% growth rate, Africa would not be able to converge or would not become an advanced economy anytime soon. So the continent needs to grow at 7%, 8% rate, and that is few countries are achieving that goal, but overall, the countries are lagging behind. And this crisis and the COVID crisis together, and they have been that has been a significant setback for the continent. So, and in order to bring the continent back on track for longer-term development, I think debt restructuring would be very, very important. And one caution that I would have is that we shouldn't wait for restructuring. We should not wait for default. We should do it as soon as possible.
Thank you so much, Hamid Rashid. They're the lead author of the UN's report on the world economic situation and prospects. Now, shortages of cash and fuel have been rubbing Nigerians up the wrong way just weeks before the country heads into an election. There have been queues at petrol stations and at banks as many rush to exchange old notes that are soon to drop out of circulation with scarce new ones. It is a volatile mix and frustrations are deepening.
Queues outside petrol stations and outside banks. Residents of Lagos wait for hours to get cash or fuel, but neither are guaranteed. Ahead of the elections, Nigeria's economy is facing two major crises. The first, a cash shortage sparked by the replacement of paper notes with newly redesigned ones as the nation hopes to curb money laundering. In spite of a January 31st deadline, banks don't have enough new currency to swap for the old notes which residents are handing in. A crisis which has left people cashless and has forced businesses to close.
The ATMs are not working. Even when you walk into the bank, they will tell you they are not giving that money, that they don't have the cash, the new notes. So it seems as if this is the only bank that is dispensing money.
The deadline for handing in old notes has been pushed back to February 10th. Petrol shortages are also plaguing the country. Nigeria is Africa's biggest crude producer, yet relies on oil imports to meet local demand due to refineries operating below their capacity. Outside this petrol station, frustrated drivers get into a fight as they wait the entire day with no certainty of getting fuel.
This is what we see every day, and I have to bring my children to school here every day, and this is what happens.
Less than a month before voting day, and frustrations are growing across the country, especially since the annual inflation rose over 21% at the turn of the year.
Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again. Take care.